Wet, dry, wet. It is one of the more confusing ways that you can set up a rig, and has baffled, I think, a lot of people, not only on forums and Facebook groups and on Instagram, but I think also professionals alike have a lot of misunderstandings about what this means. I think the basic idea is that you'd have wet effects in one amp and dry effects in the other. And I guess in a surface level understanding, you could say, well, that's probably sounds like wet dry. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you an overview of the origins of wet dry, how it's evolved, and how you can implement it into your system using the vintage original ways that were started with Robert Bradshaw, and how people have reinterpreted that and tried to morph it in a more simplistic way in the current day, in calling that wet dry. So you'll get a perspective from the beginning to the middle to the end, and you can evaluate for yourself which you think sounds best. Let's get into it. Wet, dry, wet systems. Let's do it. My name is Mason Marangella. I build rigs for the industry's top professionals. Now, I'm teaching guitarists how to build rigs like the pros, with DIY tips, easy mods, and all the tricks of the trade. I am the Rig Doctor. Wet, dry, wet was first established with Robert Bradshaw back in the mid-1980s. And this was something that he developed through working with various studio musicians. And to give you the core of it, it was really about how to translate the effects that were found inside of studios and move those into mobile racks that guitar players could take to studios, or that they could take on the road and travel with, so that they could have all the effects and treatments that they put on the guitar tone and make those available to be movable with them wherever they went, and be able to recreate some of those iconic tones that they got in the studio, but take those to the road. Now, this was a difficult and tall order because most of the effects that were being used by that time, this is when MIDI was first introduced in the mid-80s, these were all designed to be 100% wet effects. These are things like the Eventide H3000 harmonizer, the PCM series lexicon units. These were designed to be in a mix bus. A lot of them didn't even have quarter-inch ins and outs, and this needed to be adapted to work in a guitar system. And so what guys like Robert Bradshaw pioneered was this technique of taking those, putting them inside parallel mixers, and then putting them in the MIDI programmable loopers that he was making at the time. Nevertheless, there's a combination between using 100% wet effects or kill dry effects, analog dry paths, combining those in parallel mixers, and then mixing them into cabinets that would have a balance, depending on what the player wanted, of wet and dry effects. This was, in essence, the stereo system of the day. So if you listen to this interview with Robert Bradshaw, this was taken decades ago, he sort of explains a little bit about what this actually means and sort of demonstrates a little bit about how it sounds.
What drives the effects and everything here is coming from the line out of this amplifier, which is essentially picking right off of the output transformer, padded down, and going to all of the effects. So you get the whole sound of the amplifier patch going through the effects. When it comes to the effects, basically what we're doing here is the amplifier is driving all the effects simultaneously if they're selected. Okay? Obviously on the board you can select which effects you want. All of the effects then are in stereo, and they mix through the line mixer here. Okay, all of the stereo effects are added together, blended together, and they come out left and right through the VHT power amp and into your left and right cabinets. You're playing guitar through this rig, you're going to hear the dry cabinet. Okay, the effects of the icing on the cake. Because you have the ability here in this system to have either these cabinets be 100% wet effect. Remember, you're always hearing the dry sound. The dry sound is always there in the middle. You have the ability in the system to select whether or not the effects are 100% wet, meaning only echo return, only reverb, chorusing, whatever, only, and you're basically acoustically mixing them. You're hearing the dry sound and you're hearing the wet sound on either side of it in stereo. Okay.
So here's a block diagram of what that looks like, especially the early versions of these type of wet-dry rigs. In essence, you can see the guitar is going directly in to a Soldano SLO. So this would just be a tube amplifier, 100 watt. Then it's going to a load box. Okay, so this is loading the amplifier itself with a resistive load at this time. This is before they got into reactive loads. They were using resistive loads, using resistors to create this dummy load, another term you might have heard used around this, in order to have that amplifier not have any issues with blowing up because it wasn't loaded down. So you have the load box. Then that's going to go into a mixer. And in this case, a rain mixer was the parallel mixer. All of the effects were then wired into that parallel mixer, Eventide H3000, Lexicon PCM70, and those fed in stereo, 2 Roland SDE 3000 delays, which fed a power amp, a stereo power amp, that then fed the 2 cabinets. Those cabinets had a mixture of wet and dry in them. This was basically creating a stereo system for that time using the available stereo effects in order to create a wet-dry system. Now again, this is not a wet-dry-wet system because there actually isn't the dry cabinet on stage. That starts to come a little bit later in the process. At this point in time, in the early days, the dry amp was just loaded, that cabinet was loaded, in essence, with a resistive load, and it was nowhere to be found on stage because they were mixing that dry tone back in with the wet cabinets on stage. So that was the first interpretation. Here's how that sounds. Then a little bit later, this adapted to bring the dry cabinet out onto the stage. So you were no longer using a resistive load to load down the dry amplifier and then mix it in at a later time with the wet cabinets after it went through its processing. So in this fashion, you would actually bring the dry center cabinet out onto stage. So instead of going to a load box, you'd go into a line out box, which would then be feeding the rain mixer, would go through pretty much the same grouping of effects in terms of the Eventide harmonizer, the Lexicon PCM series stuff, then the Roland SDE delays, which would feed the stereo power amp, and then not only would you get that dry amplifier, which was coming right off the dry amplifier itself, the Soldano SLO, but then you would get 2 cabs that had processing in them. And in this case, there was a little bit of dry in all of the cabinets. And so you could vary the amount or the degree that happened, but you would have dry in all 3 cabinets. So this was sort of the next step in the evolution of it. And here's how that sounds. Now is the 3rd step and 4th step in that evolution of wet-dry. So this is a Michael Landau rig in the 90s, and essentially what happens here is the guitar goes into a custom audio head, And this head has a line out box, which goes one side into the speaker cabinet for the speaker through. And then the line out goes to a Lexicon MPX1, which is a multi-effects processor that will allow you to put two devices in parallel with each other. So it has pitch shift, modulation, delay, reverb. So you can choose any two of those effects, put them in parallel so that you have that, then feeding a stereo power amp in the Marshall Valve State 8008, which would then feed two cabinets. Now here's where the shift happened and really differentiates some of those early interpretations of wet-dry from this later version. In this version, the outside wet cabinets are 100% wet. There is no dry signal coming in that, so you're not getting any dry in those cabinets. You're only getting wet on the outside cabinets, and you're only exclusively getting dry in the center. So center dry, affected left and right wet cabinets. And this is why it's called wet, dry, wet. You know, you have a wet on the left, dry in the center, and then wet again on the right, wet, dry, wet. And then the only difference between that and wet, dry is you would remove one of those cabinets. You wouldn't need a stereo power amp for that. You would just be using one channel of that stereo power amp, so you wouldn't need both. But equally, the concept is the same. Now, this evolved a little bit more to kind of go back to the studio way of perhaps doing some of this processing, where instead of using a line out box, as you can see in this diagram, there's an SM57 that mics one of the speakers in the dry cabinet, puts that over into a preamp, mic pre, which then would feed any of the processing effects. In this case, it's a Lexicon MPX1, but this could just the same go into a parallel mixer and have multiple different devices in parallel that it would be going through, which would then feed a stereo power amp, which would then feed the cabinet. So really the only distinction here between these two different styles is there is no line out box, and instead you're miking one of the speakers from the dry cabinet and then feeding that into the wet effects, which then feed the wet cabinets. So this is how that sounds. Now, there are some people on YouTube and on forums that have different interpretations of what wet dry means. Now, typically what it means is that you'd have effects that are 100% wet. You'd be using a parallel mixer. These effects, are kill dry, have an analog dry path. But there's some people that are doing something that's different than this. And although I don't call it wet, dry, wet because it's not in alignment with the standard, doesn't mean that it can't sound good. Essentially what they're doing is sort of what they hear the words wet and dry mean and then implement that into a signal path. Essentially taking all of their dry effects, leading those into one amplifier, and splitting at the point that those dry effects end before the wet effects, and then continue the signal path there. Looks a lot like this diagram here that I borrowed from the guys at that pedal show in their interpretation of wet dry. And although I disagree with them in this terminology, it's more of a split system, sort of like more accurately described as dry, wet plus dry, because you have all the dry and all the wet going into one amplifier. It's still a way that you could do it, and it will still potentially have a pleasing sound. If you wanted to adapt this, which is certainly an easier way to wire things, and wanted to make it a little bit more accurate to wet dry, it just would be important that you would use two of the same amplifiers, because presumably in the real wet dry system, you only have one preamp section and you have multiple power amp sections. You have one for the dry amp, and then you have a stereo power amp for the left and right of the two wet cabinets. In this situation, as you've seen in the diagram I borrowed from that pedal show, they have two preamp sections in each of the amplifiers and two power amp sections. So everything is getting the color of both those amps. The challenge in doing it this way is you could potentially run into some polarity issues. Some people call this phasing, because not all amps have the same polarity. Equally, some pedals will invert the polarity when you step on them. Sometimes certain boosts will do that. Sometimes some stereo modulation effects will invert the polarity on one output. So it can be a challenge if you set it up one way, you hit a pedal, and it inverts the polarity, and all of a sudden all the bass is gone in your system and it doesn't sound quite right to you. So that would be one thing I would caution, but it doesn't nullify it. It doesn't mean that it can't be a good sound. I just wanted you to have a range of all the different ways that you could possibly set this up. So you're probably asking yourself now, well, what does it actually sound like when you compare the wet, dry, wet scenario that I've outlined to the split scenario? So now I'm going to take that first clip that you heard right at the beginning of the video, and I'm actually going to just sweep between the two different types of settings. One in a wet-dry context, and then it's going to fade into the split context, the wet plus wet-dry context. You can hear it going back and forth in real time and make an evaluation as to whether you think one sounds better to the other or if one is worth it over the other just in terms of the savings in time to set it up. I'm also going to take you through the types of products that you need in order to do your own wet, dry, wet system at home. Now lastly, before we conclude, I want to show you what you're going to need in order to create your own wet, dry, wet system at home. First off, you're going to need to have a line out box. One of my favorites is made by Sir, as you can see right here. It's very affordable, it's very easy to set up, it just requires that you might have an extra speaker cable so you can get from your normal speaker in your amplifier. If it's a combo, you want to have that speaker lead from the speaker itself going into it and then through to the actual speaker input on the amplifier. It's a little easier if you have a head to do this, but you can still do it either way. And then the line out would just be a guitar cable going to your wet effects. In my particular case, I'm going to the Line 6 HX effects because it's an easy way for me to move around and reroute the parallel mixed effects, in this case, delay and reverb. But you could do this with the parallel mixer, or you could do this with other pedals that have parallel applications, such as the Source Audio Collider, where there's reverb and delay in the same unit, and you can actually elect to run those in parallel, and it has an analog dry path, and it allows for kill dry, so it's sort of the perfect pedal if you want to do this and try it out with some of your amps at home. It's a really great sounding unit, and I think is an easy way to get there if you don't want to have to start involving mixers and things like that in a pedal board context. If you do want to go with a mixer, there's a great one by Musicom Labs called the Parallelizer. There's also a smaller mixer that's made by RJM called the Mini Mix, and there's also one that's kind of more pedal board friendly that has on and off switches for each one of the mixes that's made by Old Blood Noise Endeavors that you can also check out if you're interested in doing this. As always, if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you. I'd also love to hear about what your opinion is as far as whether you think the juice is worth the squeeze on some of this stuff. I know that it does seem complicated. In my mind, it sounds pretty great, but it may not be worth it to you. So I'm interested on kind of how you're weighing the sort of the pros and cons of this situation, or whether you just want to go with the stereo rig, sort of like what they were originally trying to do with wet, dry, wet in the beginning. And now we have easy ways to do that with pedals. We don't have weird stuff that needs to be put into a parallel mixer or stuff that's integrating 100% wet and then trying to get them to work with all the other amplifiers and effects that we use. So I'm really curious about that, so please do that. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Please make sure that you give us a thumbs up. And the other thing I wanted to let you know is that we have a podcast now running, the Rig Doctor Podcast. We come out with at least one episode a week. You can check that out on all of your podcast services. I also want to let you know that we've started a Patreon page. This is so that people can get one-on-one coaching with me, the Rig Doctor, through video, through Skype, Zoom, also through email, and then we just have some other basic versions of the same Patreon. as low as $4.99, where you can actually enjoy private Q&As with me, and you can enjoy private live streams that are for members only, and you get some cool discounts on all the Vertex products, as well as offers for free merchandise, free shipping, and good things like that. Now, if you don't have the finances to be able to afford the $4.99 a month subscription, we actually will give you that $4.99 subscription at no charge just by you requesting it. We just trust that when your financial circumstances have changed and you can afford the $4.99 a month, that you let us know and become a supporting member at that point. But all you have to do is send us email requesting that free account. We will grant it to you. 100% of people who ask for it get it. There's no means test required. Again, we want you to have access to getting the best tone possible, so there are no barriers that we want to put in your way to do that. But we do offer some other options there at different price points for people that like to pay a little bit more and have a little bit more access. So I do invite you to check that out. Until next time, I'm Uncle Mason, the Rig Doctor. I hope you enjoyed this conversation about wet, dry, wet, the tones, the sounds. I really love it. I hope you did too. See you later.